Movement. Most movement we're aware of is organized, orderly, and follows definite paths. In contrast, the movement of these beads is unorganized, random. Random movement is typical of very small particles, such as smoke. With the help of a special apparatus, we can see the random movement of smoke particles in still air. The same kind of random movement occurs in paint particles in liquid, in milk droplets, and even within living cells. These particles move because they are being bombarded on all sides by even smaller particles, molecules, which we can't see. This model helps explain what we saw under the microscope. The beads represent molecules, and the movement of the beads illustrates the way molecules move. The large blue bead is being pushed about by collisions with many small ones. In a similar way, the large milk droplets are being pushed about by many collisions with invisible molecules of water. Molecules move because they have kinetic energy, energy of motion. What we call temperature is, in fact, a measure of the kinetic energy of molecules. Molecules move faster as temperature rises. Because they have kinetic energy, then, molecules are in continuous random movement. When molecules are closely packed together, there will be many collisions. The movement of a specially marked molecule shows that each molecule stays more or less in place until more space becomes available. The movement of molecules from where they're concentrated to where they're less concentrated is called diffusion. In these experiments, diffusion of molecules is indicated by the spreading color. Diffusion occurs when the collisions among closely packed molecules causes them to move apart. Eventually, the molecules become evenly distributed throughout the available space. The same thing happens when more than one substance is involved. Each substance diffuses from where it's concentrated to where it's less concentrated. Sometimes moving particles will collide with a barrier. Some barriers block the movement of particles. Others allow some or all of the particles to move through them. A barrier that allows particles to move through it is called permeable. Particles can move through permeable barriers in both directions. Living cells, too, are surrounded by barriers which keep the material inside the cell from mixing with the material outside. In cells, the barriers are very thin membranes which form part of the cell wall. Diffusion of molecules through membranes is essential to life. We can get some clues about the behavior of membranes from an experiment with iodine and starch. Here's what happens when iodine and starch combine. The dish is divided by an artificial membrane which simulates a cell membrane. The dark substance appears on only one side because only the iodine molecules are small enough to pass through the membrane. The largest starch molecules are blocked. The membranes of living cells behave in a similar way. This beaker contains living yeast cells. This beaker, cells that have been killed. The cells are now soaked in dye. After a time, dye has stained the dead cells, but the living cells have remained clear. That's because living cells allow only essential substances to diffuse through the membranes, while other substances are kept out. In other words, cell membranes are selectively permeable. If they were not, nutrients could not get into the cell, and waste products could not get out. The most common substance diffusing in and out of cells is water. The diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane is called osmosis. We can see what happens in osmosis in an experiment that imitates what happens in living cells. The thistle tube contains a dyed sugar solution. The dish, water. A selectively permeable membrane separates the water from the dyed sugar. Within a few minutes, the water level has risen in the tube, but none of the dyed sugar has entered the dish. Water diffused into the tube because more water molecules hit openings in the membrane from this side, where the water is concentrated, than from this side, where both water and dyed sugar hit the membrane. Therefore, more water will move in this direction than in this direction. So water, like other substances, diffuses from where it is concentrated to where it is less concentrated. In living organisms, even small concentration differences can have dramatic effects. A time-lapse camera will help us see what happens when the soil around plants dries. The leaves wilt because water diffuses out of the cells. The same thing happens to red onion cells which have been soaked in a strong salt solution. Water diffuses from inside the cell to the outside. Now the salt water is being washed away by pure water, making the water concentration higher outside the cell than inside. Water diffusing into cells creates an outward pressure which helps plants to remain stiff and upright. When water diffuses into many cells at the same time, it can exert a powerful force. Here, dry beans are being mixed in with wet plaster, which is then allowed to harden. Water will diffuse into the dry beans. Plants use the force of osmosis in many of their life processes. In animals, too, many essential functions depend on diffusion. A fish obtains oxygen through its gills. An unborn child gets its life-giving nutrients through the mother's placenta. We live because deep in our lungs, oxygen diffuses from the air into the blood. And in our kidneys, blood is purified in part by the diffusion of wastes out of the blood. In some ways, then, most life processes depend in part on diffusion and osmosis, two of the most dynamic mechanisms of life. Here are some ways in which people make use of diffusion and osmosis. How does spraying vegetables keep them fresh? Why does salt act as a weed killer? How does sugar preserve fruit from bacteria? A more complex use of diffusion helps to save lives. This woman's blood has to be purified by a kidney machine because her own kidneys have failed. Her blood, containing many waste products, flows from her body into a coil made of an artificial membrane. A salt solution continually flows across the membrane. Why do waste products diffuse from the blood into the salt solution?